And now it's recording. Okay, you guys come in to a very special lecture. Well, welcome back. I'm very happy to see you. Just came back from the Netherlands, so I'm happy to be back at home in Antwerp and to see you. Today we will have Professor Reza Hasmat, who will give you, I mean, it's not a guest lecture because you're actually part of this course. I hope many of you already have seen him online. Now you see him in live, so thank you for coming. Very much appreciate that you are here. I will be coming back later. I leave you in the good hands of Reza, but he told me you were very interactive online, so don't hesitate to ask questions and to raise your hands, okay?
Thank you, Steffi, and hello, everyone. It's lovely to see everyone in person, and I wish I could see familiar faces, but no. So for those of you who I did not, I guess, virtually meet any acquaintances with last time, my name is Reza Hasmat. I'm technically a professor in the political science department, but my background is actually in management and sociology. And so it's kind of interesting when we are going to talk about managing in a globalized world. We're going to have it from many different perspectives. Obviously, our first and primary approach is going to be looking at how the manager sees the globalized world. But there's so many of the forces in play when we talk about globalization. So what I thought I'll do is I'll go through, I guess in a formal way, the sort of lecture slides. From my understanding, the lecture slides should be posted either now or right after the lecture. And so you can follow along in that respect, but if it's not there right now, have a look at the PowerPoints here, mind you. Okay, so it's interesting because when we talk about globalization, we're now probably, 30 years into it when we look at hyper-globalization? And so for the majority of your entire lives has been in a globalized sort of society. And so you might think this is just the norm. It's not the norm. And it has so many implications because when we talk about globalization, what we're really talking about is the interconnectedness of states, of industry. We're looking at the hyper-interconnectedness between these kinds of institutions. And it's become even more so interconnected to the point that it's nearly impossible to de-risk or decouple from another country. I'll give you a good example. I'm actually, one of my specialties is on China. That's how Steffi and I got to know each other. And we can see right now if we have any issues with China when it comes to economic relations, it is difficult for us to de-risk or decouple from China. In fact, I've ran the numbers. If, for example, my home country, Canada, was to try to decouple, not actually engage in trade with China, we would lose 15% of our economy. We would lose 1 million jobs. And that's a reality that most Western jurisdictions face as well. They face this difficulty of decoupling and de-risking from major countries. And that's just an attestment to what globalization is. Globalization is this hyper-connectedness, as I mentioned beforehand, between states, between economic systems, between resources. It is an efficiency that we've never seen in world terms beforehand. So let's get into the sort of nitty-gritty, defining what globalization is. As I mentioned beforehand, we could define globalization as a sort of an interconnectedness of economies, cultures, and populations. We can say it's an integration of national economies into a singular global system, where if you were to do any sort of modeling, you would see that if one country has a specialization in X and you have a specialization in Y, it makes sense that both countries actually engage in trade with each other. But that's from an economic standpoint. It also has in terms of interconnectedness in terms of values. You assume there's global norms in the world, but actually it's an intermeshing of different norms and values around the world in this sort of globalized sort of system. So globalization can be understood in economic terms. It can be understood in terms of values, in terms of cultures, in movements of population, in movements of resources from one area to another. A good example of this is looking at critical minerals right now. I'll go back to China again because you cannot separate China from these conversations. China has the market share in critical minerals that we need for high tech and for some of our military sort of usages. And if we can't extract those critical minerals from China, then it becomes problematic for our own sort of economies. And so you can see how that interconnectedness matters so much, where in no point in human history do we have this sort of hyper-connectedness at all. So there is a flow of goods, services, capital, and labor across borders. But when we talk about globalization, we can also talk about it in terms of a digital globalization, which you're all embedded in some form. There is a sort of a virtual globalization where you're exchange ideas and information with each other. And so globalization is not just economics, it's about society, it's about culture, it's about organizations. Now you might think, okay, that's a great sort of introduction, but what does this really all mean? And what does it mean to me as a manager? And I think it's worthwhile understanding what it means for the contemporary manager, what that means, particularly if you're in a company that's internationally connected. So let's talk about it in a different way. From a manager's perspective, if we're looking at globalization, we're really talking about economic integration. We're talking about the fact that you might have to source materials, human talent. You might have to source new markets outside your home country. And in fact, there's some countries where they solely rely on global markets rather than their domestic sort of economy. If you think of South Korea or Japan or Taiwan, they're the classic examples where a lot of the products that they do produce, a lot of the services they do produce, it's actually more for a global market rather than for their domestic one. That's the power of globalization, that interconnectedness I'm talking about. There's that technological connectivity. We are able to actually access information in any parts of the world and use that to our advantage. As a manager, you want to have as much information as possible and source it from heterogeneous sources globally. Another way to think about this is there's a theory out there, and the European Union is a great example of this theory. When you have more and more trade between countries, ultimately you're going to need a political institution to govern that trade. And after you have that political institution, the more interactions you have with those other nations, more your culture starts to look like each other because there's an exchange of ideas, an exchange of views, an exchange of norms. So there's a cultural exchange. So globalization can be understood through this sort of cultural exchanges we're talking about here. There's institutions, as I mentioned in that very simple model. There's economic sort of dependency, economic relationships requires a political institution to calibrate and to govern those economic sort of transactions. You're going to need institutions. You're going to need institutions like the World Trade Organization to govern the sort of economic discussions between states, between institutions, between multinationals. You're going to need the IMF, the World Bank. You're going to need global rules, so to speak. It's also production networks. If you're a manager, you're looking at globalization, you have to realize that your manufacturing is going to be distributed across different nations. And in fact, you are going to source manufacturing where it's more advantageous to you, whether it's cheaper labor, whether they have the sort of infrastructure to do the manufacturing that's necessary for you as a manager. Finally, when we talk about globalization, there's a standardization. There has to be a standardization of frameworks. I'll give you an example. If you're looking at accounting, so some of you might be in an accounting stream, there is a generally accepted framework globally about accounting standards. But that's from a financial standpoint. Now we have a non-financial sort of standards where we can try to have standardization in the conduct and the way we measure success, both financially and non-financially. So essentially, globalization is all this, right? It's all these things I'm speaking about. Now, what I thought I'll do is I'll give you a very quick historical understanding, very, very quick. History is not my forte. Then I'll give you some insights into what the manager needs to do to prepare and to execute in a sort of globalized sort of society. And so that's the task at hand right now. Now, if we want to go back very quickly, this is going to be perhaps more of an executive summary about the historical waves. You really got to start in the 1500s when, at least from a European standpoint, you started to develop and find new sort of colonies. There's colonial trade, there's triangular trade. You would extract resources, bringing to Europe, manufacturing in Europe. So that's the sort of first wave we're seeing of the of the historical sort of globalization that occurred. This sort of ramped up in the second wave, in the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, where we start seeing technologies, we start seeing infrastructure, transport became much more hyper, which allowed us to have greater globalization and connection. I mean, look, this is not necessarily telling you it for the sake of telling you it. It gives us some insights here. What increases globalization? Technological shifts. What increases globalization when we have hyper transportation? We have greater abilities to become more interconnected. That's what increases globalization. And that's what we see historically in wave one and wave two. We also see it's about extracting resources and moving those resources to an area where it can be manufactured in the most efficient way and then sold to markets that are willing to pay for that finished product, so to speak. So it is that's what the historical sort of waves tell us. We also see there can be disruptions to globalization very easily. You experience one of those during COVID, for example. Historically, we saw it during World War I, World War II, that this really fragmented our globalization. So it is tenuous. It is subject to forces that can disrupt globalized sort of processes. We also see, after World War II, institutions. We see that there's a building of institutions. The more sort of connections that we have, the more institutions we need to manage this sort of connections. And that's why we see the rise of the Bretton Woods institutions. We see World Trade Organization coming to play. Again, each wave of globalization is informed by politics, technology, and power dynamics. Contemporary globalization really, and this is, I guess, the generation that you've been socialized in, it really begins at the end of the Cold War, where there's domination of particular ideas. So we've seen neoliberal ideas tend to spurn out at the end of the Cold War. We see more trade liberalization. We've seen values and norms becoming much more homogenized, which has never been the case in global history. We see China's economic opening. We see internet and mobile communications in real time. We see policy liberalization occurring, reducing trade barriers. We see the rise of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now it's been expanded a bit more. There's Indonesia, for example, or Brazil. And they're counterweighting Western dominance. So essentially, this is what the contemporary globalization climate is. So what can we talk about at this particular moment in terms of globalization, in terms of a background? Well, you've probably seen Brexit, experienced Brexit. You've seen the rise of Trumpism in the United States. You've seen a rise of right-wing nationalism in parts of Europe. And a lot of it is a reaction to globalization. A lot of it is people are not equipped in many ways to adapt that quickly to that interconnectedness because it threatens your everyday. Now, I'm speaking in very high-level terms. Let's talk in the most simplistic terms. If you are a nation that has manufacturing, and that manufacturing is relatively more expensive in your nation, if you're a manager, a responsible manager should try and find manufacturing that's cheaper elsewhere. That's the nature of the profit motive. That's the nature of the capitalistic society. And so if you're a manager and say you have manufacturing in Belgium and it's too expensive because labor costs are too high, because infrastructure costs are too high, to source those materials through transportation is too high, it makes sense to move it to a much low-cost sort of environment. So as a manager, that's the sort of decision you most likely will face, and you would have to do that. But then you got to think about what are the implications of that. That's not your role as a manager to think about the implications, but there are implications. What the implications are is that, well, you're going to effectively lose jobs in Belgium. You're effectively not going to have that manufacturing base as much as beforehand. It also means you're you're more reliant on other countries where you're sourcing the manufacturing from. But as a manager, that's not usually your sort of decision making to think about the sort of political sort of implications. Your sort of decision making ought to be, is this the best interest of my company? So it's a bit tricky, because if you are thinking about how does this affect, in broad terms, my society, it has implications for your society that might be negative. So ultimately, we are in an inflection point because we realize there are more and more consequences of globalization at this stage. We see this when we look at current tensions between the United States and China, the European Union and China. Here's a scenario. China has much more electric vehicles. It's overproducing electric vehicles. And in that stance, it means it needs to find new markets to basically sell those oversupply of electric vehicles. Europe needs electric vehicles, and its in-house capacity to develop and manufacture in a cheap fashion these electric vehicles is a bit stymied. So in that scenario, in a logical sort of construction here, is that China should trade with the European Union. But if China does ultimately send all these EVs, electric vehicles, to the European Union, it's going to crowd out and probably destroy any sort of European Union sort of EV sort of networks and manufacturing, because it's cheaper. And actually, it's also technologically much more advanced. So what should you do? Well, if you're a manager, your goal is to maximize profit. If you are a political decision maker, your goal is very different. Your goal is probably to try to protect your sort of national economy. And so there's this sort of dualism that happens in a globalized sort of society. One of the questions I've been asked to think about a lot is, are we seeing a reversal of globalization? So I gave you this sort of scenario about EVs, right? Imagine this is happening. Not imagine, it is happening, that there are manufacturing leaving Belgium. What should you do if you're a manager? Should you continue to support this? If you're a Belgian manager and you know it's cheaper to source materials, it's cheaper to source labor, it's cheaper to get manufacturing overseas, should you move your manufacturing overseas? For most, they would say yes. Would you do that? So, okay, let me put it a different way. Let's see a show of hands. I don't need to get a sort of verbal qualitative response. Let's see a show of hands. If you knew that it's cheaper to source your materials overseas, you knew it's cheaper to actually manufacture your goods and services overseas, and you're a Belgian company, would you source it overseas? Let's see a show of hands who say, yes, I will source it overseas. That's it? Oh, I was expecting more. I was expecting 99, 95%. Why would you not source it overseas? It's cheaper. Yeah?
Quality.
And the same quality. Yeah?
Does that take into account a more difficult supply chain?
So it's, okay, so we're looking at supply chain management. The assumption is you are able to source your goods, your services, your manufacturing in a country where, from a transportation standpoint, from an infrastructure standpoint, it is seamless. And it is cheaper. So why would you not do it? Yep.
Geostrategic?
Why is that your concern? Your concern is to make profit. Wait, we are management students, right?
Yeah, but like, say that we're in a company such as Airbus or
Right.
Italian, for example, right? You have certain things that are critical to a larger sector and to our Western society as a whole.
Right.
So then maybe you could go to go to the then the elected party and say, look, like
Okay. So let me refine the question. There are special industries, special sectors. Defense is one of them. Airbus would be one of them, where they are protected industries. They can either be infant industries or protected industries that are strategically important to the state. So defense would be one of that. Airbus would be one of that. And usually, if in those scenarios, you might overinflate your goods and services in exchange for maintaining a presence in their home country. But for the most part, we're talking about non-protected industries, non-infant industries. If you're a manager, a responsible manager, if you're responsible to your shareholders, you must offshore. Yes? Of course, of course.
Something that has built its entire image and reputation on being a local company that supports the community. And especially if it's something that deals with skilled craftsmen, then it's much more difficult to choose to ship jobs abroad.
Okay, so let's go. I mean, I love that you said that. So it's like, look, if we have local communities, local skills, we need to protect that. What is your number one objective as a manager in a publicly traded company? Yeah? Make profit. Who are you responsible to? Your shareholders. Are you being responsible to your shareholders by not making more profit? Usually I got to say this to my sociology students or my poli-sci students, and then I have to explain the profit motive. I didn't think I have to say it to my management students. Your goal is to make profit. And now you can do the modeling. If the modeling suggests that it's more profitable to be in-house, to actually manufacture it in-house, even though you're taking the economic hit to do so, sure. But the end goal here is to make profit. And one of the ways in which you can make greater profit is to reduce your manufacturing and to source your materials in a cheaper way. And this is ultimately why we see hyperglobalization occurring. Because most managers have made that sort of calculation and said we need to have this sort of we need to utilize the interconnectedness that we have, and we need to manufacture overseas. We need to source materials overseas where it's cheaper. We need to source labor where it's cheaper. What would be the retort to that? So we have strategic industries. So the retort would be when there's strategic industries, we could protect it. When there are infant industries we want to develop, we can protect it. Is there any other retort, any other sort of ways we can not justify moving our manufacturing overseas in a globalized sort of society? Nope. So hopefully at the end of this lecture, at the end of the course, or at the end of your program, if they're doing their jobs right for your management program, you would realize that your objective is to make profit. And your objective is to be responsible to your shareholders. So when we're looking, it is, in many respects, we are at an inflection point at a societal level about this. Because maybe globalization isn't the answer if economies are not doing as well as it once was. And this explains why we might see Brexit. This might explain the American First. It might explain the rise of right-wing nationalism in Europe. It's because people are, from a societal standpoint, are not getting the benefits of globalization. But again, you're a manager. You're being trained to be a manager. And you need to understand your managerial responsibilities, particularly in a publicly traded company, is to your shareholders. Yes?
Can't you also adopt a inflection point where you're taking also into account the potential political, the political effects of your decisions?
That's not your role, unless you can tie it to your bottom line. So Another way to coax this sort of question, if you are a politically minded individual, not a manager, a politically minded individual, and you want to influence managers, you would tie the politics with the managerial impetus for profit. So in other words, if the organization or the corporation or the business is losing money because of the politicking, they would change course. So that's why you often see Belgium First. Well, you don't really see that much, but you see it in other countries. Belgium First products. It's a great marketing tool, and it invites greater profiting in that respect. So in that way, you're marrying the politics with the business sort of case to have more profit by doing Belgium First. Sorry, there's a hand here. Right. Right. So remember, profit making is your ultimate goal. And anything that threatens that will influence your behavior. So if a government says you need to onshore, you will have to do the modeling to onshore because you can actually threaten your profit making. And that's a sort of inflection point that we have, that sort of mixing between politics and business right now. Generally speaking, shareholders do not want to have their business managers engage in politics. There's an uneasiness about that. Mind you, there are activist shareholders. Mind you, there are companies that do try to engage in the politicking. But for the most part, that's not the norm. So globalization is preaching this sort of environment we're engaged with. Now, what are the issues? I want you to think as a manager. My whole objective here is to get you to think like a manager. And as a manager, how do I manage a particular company, a business, within the current sort of environment of globalization? There is one strategic issue that you would normally engage with. Are you going to standardize or are you going to localize your product? There's a fundamental tension here. So, for example, if you do have an Apple product, it's pretty much standardized anywhere in the world. So most of you seem to have Apple products, at least from your laptops or your iPhones. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. For the most part, it is standardized. There might be some variations here and there in terms of the chip components. There might be variations here and there in terms of whether or not you have an eSIM or a standardized SIM. But for the most part, it's fairly standardized. And that is the product of globalization in many respects. But within that, you can have a globalized company and have localization as well. And you develop a sort of a product that has cultural resonance to the local sort of environment you're in. So McDonald's is infamous for this. In McDonald's in France and in Quebec, the province of Quebec in Canada, they sell beer or wine. It's a localized sort of environment. I don't know if they do that here, but no, okay. But there's a localization. That's what I mean there. So you're a global brand with a localized product. So we see this sort of strategic issue that all managers face. You want to, even though it is a globally sourced product, you want to localize it so it appeases and it appeals as well to the local population. Neither approach is inherently superior. It really depends on the industry and product. But all I want to highlight is you can have a globalized product or service and you can localize it, or you can just standardize it everywhere you are. And that's the sort of things that we've uncovered over the last 30-something years since we've had hyperglobalization. And this is a balance that must be consciously negotiated and continuously managed. Remember, at the end of the day, your market is local. Even if you're selling global products and services, your market is a local one. So why are we buying Apple products? Why do we buy Apple products? Why does most people here have Macs or iPhones? Yeah? Quality? So there's no other products that have the similar quality?
Maybe for what I do, no.
No? Okay. So you just purely for quality?
Yeah.
Yeah? Any other reasons? Yeah? The ecosystem? What do you mean by that?
Integration with other applications.
Right. So you're into their ecosystem, their products, and so forth. Any other reasons why? Yeah? Good marketing. What is the marketing towards? I mean, is it the same marketing for the Belgian market as the Chinese market, as the American market? You would assume not. Why not? You would assume. Right. Right. So even if you're selling a global product, you need to localize it. But often it has to do with price. Often it has to do with quality. It's a price-quality ratio. And beyond that, you have that sort of global product that is localized, so to speak. So that's one of the strategic issues we often see for globalized sort of products. Another strategic issue we see is integration versus responsiveness. We often want to have an international strategy leveraging a home capabilities with modest adaptation. I'll give you an example of this. If you are British Petroleum, BP, your home country matters a lot. So where your organization is incorporated, it matters a lot. Because that's where your organizational behavior is coming from. That is where your sort of, the rules and laws and frameworks you have to abide by for the most part. And so that matters a lot in terms of where your home nation is. So there's a strand of the work and research that suggests where your company is incorporated matters more than where your company is actually engaging with. So for example, Apple is incorporated in California or in the United States, and it's bounded by the rules and regulations of California, even though it is manufactured mostly, pretty much everything's in China. In fact, it says it. It says, was it designed in California, but actually made in China? That is globalization. That's your international strategy. You are leveraging your home capabilities and your home sort of ecosystem there and ensuring you can adapt it to global markets. There's also a multi-domestic strategy, which is completely separate, where you treat every country separately, and there's local autonomy. So McDonald's is another example of this sort of multi-domestic strategy. They have global products, but each country is incorporated differently. There's McDonald's Belgium, McDonald's France, McDonald's US. And each country actually has different strategies in the way they produce, or rather, in the way they market their product. There's a global strategy, tightly integrated, centralized, standardized approach. There's also a transnational strategy, which is really the holy grail. It's the ultimate sort of strategy for efficiency and responsiveness. So the global and transnational strategies are interesting because they are standardizing a product and selling the product and services consistently throughout, no matter where you are in the world. So ultimately, the strategic issue is, do I integrate into the home, into the country in which I'm embedded with, or do I respond to the conditions in which I'm embedded with? And really, the choice determines the organizational structure. Now, let me put it to you in a different way. What's an infamous Belgian company? Nothing? No one was going to have no Belgian companies that's infamous? Surely you have companies that are infamous. Nothing? No one? Give me a company from Belgium that's global. Anything? Yep. Sorry? Got nothing? Yep. I'm sorry? Abbey Imbim. Oh, the beer people. Got it. Okay. That's the direction we're going to go. Okay. All right. How do we market that globally? Do we say it's a Belgian company? Do we localize it? What would you do? What is the advantage of marketing it as a Belgian company? Yeah? I'm sorry? And why would it help your sales? But the assumption is people know about Belgian beer outside of Europe or Belgium. Why is it more premium? It's because it's cool. So we need to market this then. How do we market it to? We're bringing so if we're bringing this beer to the Australian market, how would we market this and say, well, it's Belgium, it's cool, but are people associating Belgium with cool? Sorry to be very frank here. A lot of the work, so I'll give you an example. My first job was actually as a diplomat. And I worked in Australia, and I worked in trying to be doing public diplomacy in Australia, which basically means I'm trying to market Canada to Australia. So we would do a lot of surveys, and when we do these surveys, Australians would tell us, hey, Canadians and Australians are the same, except we're not technologically advanced. How could they not think we're not technologically advanced? It was an affront to my sensibilities. How could you not think we have technology in Canada? We're not a backward society. And so often the reason for saying this analogy is you should be quite surprised, you should not be quite surprised to hear that even if you think Belgian beer is amazing, it's a premium product, it may not translate overseas. People may not even know where Belgium is, to be very frank. Even in Australia, people may not know where Canada was. Actually, we got that. It's like, you don't know where Canada is? How's that possible? So the assumption here is you need to understand your local market. And you need to understand that if your home country is Belgium and you're exporting a product overseas, you might have to understand you have to market it much differently. So we can say for sure Belgian beer might be exotic. It is exotic. But is it good? Does it matter if it's good or not? Well, if we're in a marketing course, I'll tell you it doesn't really matter. But for the sake of this conversation, I would say you need to localize it. And the way you localize it is through emotions. That's one of the best ways to localize something. So what gets Belgians fired up? What makes you emotionally charged and excited and interested immediately? Is there anything in particular? Nothing? Is there anything that gives you interested as a society just immediately? I'll give you an example. In Canada, hockey. If you talk about hockey, our population gets excited. If I market a Canadian beer to hockey, it makes perfect sense. If people know about hockey outside of Canada into the environment you're engaged with, you can market the Canadian beer with hockey overseas. You're localizing it. So when I was talking beforehand in a very abstract way about norms, values, etc., that's what I'm talking about. You need to understand your host society's norms and values. And that's something where it really influences the sort of strategic decisions you're making. Do I integrate? Am I responsive? Am I localizing? Am I being a global product? And when I meant the transnational strategy, what I meant there was there has to be something that we can all identify with. There are very few global brands out there. Think about all the global brands that you guys know. What are the brands that are known even as the far reaches of North Korea? What do you think they are? There's only a very few of them. Tell me a global brand that you know. Sorry, Apple? Yeah. Yeah. Nike? Yeah. Nike, Apple? Yeah. Coca-Cola? Give me two more. McDonald's? Yeah. Google? Well, Google's unknown everywhere, but yeah, it's pretty much, yeah. No, I don't know about that part, but okay, it has more reach in the Western world. The classic examples is Coca-Cola. Classic examples being McDonald's. Those are some of the examples of Nike. And a lot of it has to do with marketing. But these are global products because they're global things that they're providing. We all need shoes, Nike. Do we all need Apple products? Debatable, but we all might need phones to be connected. Apple might be the market leader to a great extent. So this is what I mean when I talk about the transnational strategy. There's very few companies where they can have a strategy where what they're selling or what service they provide is both efficient and responsive not only to the global needs but to the local needs as well. Nike may not have to localize its products because we all need shoes, we all need efficient shoes, and so it is a global sort of unit that it sells. Another strategic issue is location decisions, and this is where I started having these conversations with you, where there's throwback. For manufacturing, we need to, generally speaking, the old rule of thumb used to be you want to have manufacturing near labor, near customers, near materials, or near specialized skills. But as transportation networks become cheaper, more efficient, much quicker, you can source labor, you can source materials and specialized skills globally. So I remember a few years ago in the Suez Canal, a ship got stuck. And that completely disrupted supply chains across the world for days and days. It cost the world billions of dollars. But it also illustrated the idea that our transportation networks are super fast, much more so than ever in human history. And it allows us to have strategic issues that shift. We don't need to have manufacturing where we're selling our product. Research and development, increasingly dispersed to top global talent and local knowledge. Where should we source research and development? We tend to do so where there's the best investments, where state investments in research and development, where companies' investments in research and development go. It's usually where the money flows. Put differently, you need to understand if you're a company and you have an R&D, it might be worthwhile to have that R&D in a particular country where the laws might protect your intellectual property, where the capital might be more easily accessible. And so research and development, again, is that sort of location decisions that you're making. Now, it's interesting because we're now at a stage where artificial intelligence and machine learning is changing services. We have much more automated services than ever beforehand, so that can shift the way we have locations. We don't need to have services, if it's an AI sort of unit, in Belgium. It can be in the middle of Antarctica. It could be anywhere that's much more low cost in terms of energy costs for AI. So it illustrates to you how we're adapting, but it's still driven by the profit motive. I can't stress that enough. All of this that I'm talking about is just a shorthand, nice way of saying, does it maximize my profit? Now, as I said, if I was giving this course or giving this lecture to a different audience, a sociologist, we'd be critiquing this a lot. But are we doing you a disservice to tell you that that is the world you're going to enter? If you're going to be a manager, you must be looking at the profit motive. So your strategic issue here for location decisions ultimately fall to, is it more profitable in the short, medium, and long term to do this? So location choices are dynamic. They're not static. You must adapt to changes. There are access to technology issues. There's access to skills issues. Labor costs are shifting. But at the end of the day, all of these are variables you use to calculate, is it cheaper? Can I get the same service or similar in-kind service? Can I get the same product or similar in-kind product at a cheaper cost? And these are part of your location decisions that you're making. Another thing to think about when it comes to globalization is supply chain management. Global chains offer efficiency, but they do create new vulnerabilities. I mentioned the Suez Canal example where it disrupted supplies. COVID disrupted supplies. When there's spats between nations, it can disrupt supplies. A good example is that Europe has long been reliant on Russia for natural gas. This is a globalization in action, but if there's political sort of realities that shift the ability to source that natural gas, it makes it much more difficult. So really, we can see there is we need to be much more strategic in our supply chain management. And what I mean by that is we need to have our supplies from much more diverse sources that we're not susceptible to disruption. Hand up there, yeah.
Yeah. Would you say that then under this, geostrategic right now, wouldn't you say that it would be then advisable if you're thinking about it from a long-term perspective that we should actually start to
Diversify?
and
Yeah.
also concentrate in our own market where we are safe because Russia now with way Trump the states like the world is becoming a lot less stable. So for business that means that if we stretch ourselves too thin, then maybe in the short term we're maximizing profit, but in the long run we're making ourselves incredibly
Vulnerable to, right. So what we've learned is this vulnerability, especially after COVID, during COVID, after COVID. We've learned that a globalized society can maximize profit, efficiencies of scale, and so forth, but it also increases vulnerability. So at the heart of the question is this: what should we do to reduce our risk? Well, the assumption is that most nations can actually do something about it. So if we're looking at minerals, for example, critical minerals, if I am telling you that one country has the market share in critical minerals and that one country is going to use that to their advantage and maybe shut off the valve for giving us a supply of those critical minerals, if you are a nation, you should stockpile critical minerals. That's the logical solution here, right? If you're a company, you should stockpile the sort of materials you're going to be using, or have diverse sources in which you're accessing these materials. Problem at hand is, it's not as though you can't, it's a very logical proposition. The problem at hand is that it's very difficult for you to actually diversify. Especially if we're looking at minerals or raw materials. There's only very few countries that have them. And even more so, even if they have them, it takes a long time to develop the infrastructure to extract them. That's just looking at materials. Let's look at it in a different way. Let's just say you're getting all your manufacturing from Vietnam because it's cheaper labor, better infrastructure for giving you those supplies that you need and at a cheaper cost. If Vietnam says no, we're not going to sell you these things anymore, or we're going to increase labor costs, or we're going to increase our manufacturing costs. Well, what the company normally would have done is they'll go somewhere else. They'll go to a cheaper place, and then they'll go to another cheaper place, and another cheaper place. But the assumption has always been there's always a cheaper place to go to. Moreover, the assumption has always been that it's just easy to pick up from Vietnam and go to Indonesia, or go from Indonesia to go to Malaysia. It takes time. So at the heart of your question is companies should strategically think. Maybe they should just onshore everything. But it's still more expensive to do it onshore. That's the problem at hand, first. Second, it is difficult to stockpile materials if you're in a company that needs materials. So this is, even though we know there's some optimization failures, this is still much more optimal, the system that we have. In many respects, when it comes to supply chain management, some of the key things we talk about now is about resiliency. Can Apple survive if there's a critical minerals shortage? Because All your phones and chips there, a lot of the technologies there does rely on critical minerals. So can Apple survive? How does it increase resiliency? Well, maybe it can develop new technologies that doesn't require that. There's a classic example of this. You guys know Lego, right? Like Lego, the toys. Lego was made out of oil initially. Well, it's an oil product. And it took a long time for Lego to transition from an oil product to one that uses no oil at all. But to do so, it had to develop the technologies to do that. But to do so, it required a consumer base that demanded it. Now, this is where the manager's hat is not coming on now. If the consumer demands something else, boycotts it, it can be problematic for Lego, and it was. If managers need to react to that, again, because it's affecting their profit motive. So, we need to do supply chain management resiliency, and that's something that globalization has taught us. But it's easier said than done, because there's only certain things we can do to limit the risk in being a truly globalized sort of society. There's also a political and regulatory complexity. That's a strategic issue that we face in a globalized sort of environment. Imagine you're a company operating in multiple countries. There's different legal sort of systems, different regulatory systems, different political contexts. Let's look at data. In the European Union, there's very stringent data rules, data protection rules. So Apple, Google, some of these major tech companies need to abide by that and change their algorithms or change their practices when they're operating in Europe. It's going to be a very different sort of product, ultimately, than it might be in the United States or in China. In fact, Google cannot operate in China. It just doesn't, because they did not want to abide by the local rules. There are geopolitical risks, which we've talked about. We looked at the Russia example, so I'm not going to say too much about that. There are regulatory differences, which creates both risk and opportunities. So I mentioned there's a double material, well, I didn't say those words, but there's a financial sort of accounting, and then there's non-financial accounting. And in Europe, there's double materiality rules now, where companies of a certain size must abide by reporting their financial statements, but also their non-financial statements, i.e., what are they doing for environmental concerns? What are they doing for corporate social responsibility concerns? They need to report that now. So if you're a multinational firm, you need to understand the regulatory environment in Europe, even though you are going to be doing the same product, same service, but it's going to potentially change your behavior by virtue of the regulatory environment you're operating in. So these are not only operational questions, it's also survivability. If you cannot adapt to the regulatory environment that you're engaged with, if you cannot adapt to the localized sort of laws, to the political context, you're more likely going to fail even though you're a globalized company. So that is something that a manager must be acutely aware of, is these sort of political and regulatory complexities that you do face. So there is an inherent paradox here. And the inherent paradox is that even though we are a hyper-globalized society, there's still geographical concentrations. So in spite of all of what I've said to you, that we should source materials where it's the cheapest, we should source labor where it's the cheapest, we should go where there's specialized goods and services where it's the cheapest. Interestingly enough, when you look at the realities for certain industries, certain sectors, there is a clustering that occurs. An example of that might be Silicon Valley, tech. So the tech industry is clustered in Silicon Valley. Entertainment might be clustered in Hollywood or Bollywood or Nollywood in Nigeria. Finance, the City of London, New York. So it begs the question, why do we still, even though we're in a truly globalized society, hyper-connected, I am telling you that you need to go to places where you can maximize profit, why do we continuously see this clustering? Part of it is you got to look at these kinds of sectors. We're looking at tech, we're looking at finance, and we'll talk about entertainment. Let me first talk about tech and finance first and foremost. It requires a very specialized knowledge base in order to engage in that industry in an effective way. So it makes sense to cluster that. So when you have an industry that is purely knowledge-oriented or mostly knowledge-oriented, It is going to create a clustering effect. Hence why we see Silicon Valley. Hence why we see London and New York City as cities of finance, or Hong Kong or Singapore as cities of finance, because there's a clustering of knowledge communities there. It is a different kind of sector. In other words, what I'm suggesting to you, even though I'm giving you generalized statements about globalization, there are exceptions to many of these kinds of generalizations. And so that gives us this inherent paradox where local clusters do develop. In entertainment, it makes sense to cluster your actors, actresses. It makes sense to cluster your writing talent in one area because, again, it's producing a particular type of knowledge. So it's an efficiencies of scale there for these specialized kinds of sectors. So specialized labor pools create self-reinforcing talent cycles, so to speak. Supplier ecosystems and institutional support matter enormously in that environment. So they are globally connected, but locally embedded here. Another sort of attendant question I want to ask, and then we'll have a very quick break, is who drives globalization? Foremost, we can articulate that multinational corporations are the ones who are driving globalization for the most part. They're seeking markets, they're seeking resources, they're seeking efficiencies of scale. We can also suggest financial institutions with the global outflows of capital and sourcing of capital. They're moving trillions across borders daily. So they're also partially responsible for globalization and driving it furthermore. International institutions reinforce globalized norms, creating rules and norms. So the IMF, the World Trade Organization, governments and their policy decisions can also enable or resist integration. So they're also a major player in the globalized sort of setup. Technology companies, the speed of technology, it fosters an infrastructure for global connectivity. And finally, diaspora communities and civil society. We're more of a multi-ethnic, multi-ethnic sort of diasporas around the world. And with that, they are with fostering a networks and sets of norms and cultural norms that creates a global sort of consensus of what it means to be a human being, so to speak. So I would suggest to you these are the factors that are really driving globalization. So I'm going to pause in one moment, but before I do pause, I cannot stress this enough. There's very few operating principles that managers, that is a truism no matter where you are. One, organizations want to survive. All organizations want to survive. All enterprises want to survive. All institutions want to survive. There's an inherent part of the DNA of an institution, of a corporation, of a business, they do want to survive. So that's a sort of inherent psychology. Two, in order to survive, particularly in a capitalistic society, you need to have profit. And so if you're a manager and you're operating in this globalized world, you need to survive as an organization, and part of that calculation to survive is making profit. And so when we talk about globalization and its forces and its implications, I want you to bear in mind those truisms that I was talking about, that these businesses want to survive. Now, equally so, what happens when globalization means your local business here is not surviving? It means that they need to be adaptive to survive. And so I'll talk a bit more in the second half about how businesses can resist globalization's negative effects. But before I continue with the second half, after the break that is, are there any questions at this stage? Any thoughts, concerns, questions or anything I can reinforce? If not, it is 11:31. Why don't we come back at 11:40 and we'll do the second half. Okay, why don't we start back? So the conversation we're really having is about what globalization is, who does it affect, and why do we engage in globalized processes? I think it's worthwhile understanding who benefits mostly from globalization. So we're going to start critiquing globalization a bit more now and try to understand who's benefiting and who's not. This is not a moral claim about this is right or wrong. It's just telling you who's benefiting for the most part based on evidence and who's not. Foremost, we do see that emerging market exporters are major benefactories of globalization. China is a prime example of that, where they've lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty by being the world's manufacturing base. And ironically, now it's moving from a manufacturing sort of hub to one where they're doing services and technological innovation. But they are a major beneficiary, emerging markets, exporters, that is. Small open economies seemingly are beneficiaries of globalization. Think Singapore, Ireland, Switzerland as global hubs. Interestingly, in those three examples, they're also financial hubs. Ireland, particularly because of their taxation codes, it's one of the most conducive places for a global corporation to be incorporated because of the tax codes that really gives them an advantageous sort of position. So much of the world's largest companies do have technically their home offices in Ireland for that very reason. Singapore is a financial hub, Switzerland as well. We also see resource exporters are beneficiaries of globalization. Those who have the most resources, they're able to use that to their greatest advantage. So I'll give an example of Australia, I'll give an example of China, Brazil. These are countries in which, because of their vast sort of natural resources, they're able to utilize and expand their markets beyond their home country, and giving them unparalleled access to global markets. This can be a mixed blessing because it also means we're reliant on them for those sources of materials. And I mentioned that when we were looking at critical minerals. Often the integration to the global supply chain drives economic growth. There's very few drivers of economic growth, particularly post-World War II. And one of them has to be economic liberalization. One of them has to be the greater integration of global supply chain. If you see this in a macro sense, that's what's really leading economic growth, and globally speaking. So ultimately, the success, the beneficiaries of globalization are those nations, are those companies who are globally competitive and have export capabilities, so to speak. So that's at a macro level. At a micro level, the societies, the countries that are more beneficiaries of globalization are generally those societies that have highly skilled workers. The engineer, the financier, the tech workers, they usually thrive in a globalized environment. Those who have capital, so those who own capital, global investment firms, environments where there's tax optimization, i.e. like in Ireland, you find they are beneficiaries of globalization. Global cities, so the urbanite, global cities that generally have urban professionals, a New York, a London, a Singapore, they generally prosper in our globalized sort of societies. Consumers, generally speaking, tend to also benefit from globalization because it does lead to lower prices for the most part. It does provide greater variety of products, and there's global access to products. And so those positioned for the global economy often see substantial gains, for the most part. And now, let's talk about the flip side of the equation. Generally speaking, what are the qualities, what are the attributes of those individuals, of those societies, of those companies that are not the beneficiaries of globalization? Economies unable to compete. Those countries that deindustrialize but do not re-industrialize. What I mean by that is this. If you're a country that had an industrial base, a manufacturing base, and that manufacturing base moved overseas, it is beholden on that country to try and develop and reindustrialize it in a different way. So you can move from a manufacturer that I don't know, crudely put, is doing garments. And if all those garment making goes shipped overseas, maybe you should have manufacturing in high-tech robotics. In other words, you're reindustrializing. So countries that do not reindustrialize generally do fail in the globalized sort of society because they're not positioning their companies to be strategically advantageous to them. So we also see conflict affected states. That speaks for itself. If you're in a conflict zone, you're not necessarily going to be a beneficiary of globalization. Manufacturing workers in developed countries are generally not going to be beneficiaries of globalization because their labor costs are just simply too high. There's a China shock, for example, eliminated millions of middle-class manufacturing jobs because people shipped their manufacturing to China in the last 10, 15 years. Now they're shipping it to Indonesia and shipping it to Vietnam and Cambodia and parts of Southeast Asia because it's even much more low-cost labor environment than China is right now. And communities that are dependent on a single industry, when that is the reality, generally speaking, you're not well positioned to meet, to be the beneficiary of globalization. Of course, there are exceptions to that, as I mentioned beforehand. If you are in finance or tech, entertainment, that might be the exceptions to the rule. But for the most part, communities that are dependent on a singular industry are generally are going to be set up to fail in a globalized sort of society. So I've given you some truisms based on the evidence that we have about who benefits and who does not benefit from globalization. We can even take it at a more micro level. We see there's what the non-beneficiaries of globalization experience is in-country inequality. So actually decreasing because of this convergence. Even within country inequalities increasing in most nations as well. We see there's geographical inequalities that occur in globalization. Now let me put it to you in a different way because look, I'm giving you the outcomes, but I'm not giving you the reason why this happens. The entire idea is if you have a box where in one side of the box, they can manufacture something at a cheaper cost, and on the other side of the box, there are consumers who are willing to pay for that particular product. It makes sense that that's the sort of reasoning that you would go to the country that has the lowest costs and you would supply to the country that's willing to pay the highest price for it. So in aggregate, it is an efficient system. But when you disaggregate it, it is a very inefficient system. And that's why you find inequalities are going to increase if you're looking in a microcosm of a country. So globalization does generate greater wealth. That's what I'm suggesting to you. In aggregate, it will generate greater wealth. But who actually benefits in this greater wealth, it's concentrated more so. And that's why we're seeing both between country inequality and within country inequalities increasing in present day. There is, in other words, geographical inequities, not only at a national and global level, but even between cities there's inequalities going on. And you might ask yourself, well, so what? This might lead to political backlash. It might lead to greater risk uncertainty if you're a business. So managers must understand these effects, and it shapes the business environment. Because over time, nations might say we need to do something to reduce this inequality. And they might pass much more stringent regulations, which might affect your bottom line. So as a manager, you must be aware of these geopolitical pressures and these national pressures, which are rooted within the inequalities that globalization produces. Now we're going to shift gears and talk about global rights and social responsibility. More and more, the manager must be aware of being a socially responsible actor. And it's usually the best, at least from a management standpoint, if you can have profit as well as being a socially responsible actor, and you can merge that, that's wonderful. In fact, that's the most optimal outcome. So you can have eco-friendly sort of products which boost profit. That's a win-win situation for everyone involved. So within that sort of context, when we look at global rights and social responsibilities, we have to remember, if you're a multinational, you are going to be operating across vastly different legal and social contexts. So rights-based sort of understandings can be very difficult. Okay, let me give you this thought experiment. What's a universal human right? Give me a universal human right. That is, everyone, no matter where you are in the world, it's a human right that you should adhere to. Speech, thank you. Love that one. If I'm starving, I am utterly starving, do I care about the freedom of speech? Now, we forget this because, as I said, at the end of the Cold War, we have a universal sort of set of human rights that we believe that's the universal set of rights. There's actually two sets of human rights, historically. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. There's an International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and there's an International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. Put differently, the International Convention on Political and Civil Rights is what our Western jurisdictions generally practice. Freedom of speech, the right to protest, the right to assembly. There's also economic, social, and cultural human rights, the ability to eat, have food, shelter, and clothing. In other words, when we talk about rights, there's usually an order of rights that different nations subscribe to. It's not that they don't adhere to the rights, it's just not as important. Which brings me back to my analogy when someone said speech. The freedom of speech matters a lot, obviously. It is a human right. But does it trump the ability to live? I would argue, and I'm sure many of you would if I coax it in this language, I'd rather have the right to eat first, and then maybe the right to talk about it afterwards. And so this is another way to think about global rights and social responsibility. You might be operating in environments where people want the freedom, they do want freedoms and rights, but their ordering of what's important differs than your own society. So if you are going to be engaged in rights-based sort of activism as a business, be aware that it might have a different ordering, so to speak. So if I'm working this is a tricky conversation, obviously. My family's from Trinidad, which is in the Caribbean. I grew up in Canada, so I'm pretty much embedded within a Western sort of understanding of rights, where freedom of speech, freedom of association matters, akin to, I would suggest, Western Europe. But if I'm operating in countries where they're starving, it's kind of hard-pressed for me to say to them, freedom of speech first, and you can starve. So you got to remember, as a manager, you might be operating in environments where rights are important, but again, the stress on what's important varies. So there's also environments where labor rights might be different. Now, how do you overcome this? Well, I'll give you examples of how states have tried to overcome this or try to push rights in a different direction. You can influence the rights of the countries in which you're engaged with through your supply chain management. You could tell your suppliers you must adhere to certain labor rules that you adhere to in your home country. So that's an effective way to actually influence rights. So it really begs the question, should companies apply home standards, meet local minimums, or global standards? There's no right or wrong answer to this. It really depends on the context in which you engage with. Reputation might play a role, consumers' interests might play a role, investors' sentiment might play a role, regulatory pressures might play a role. They all interact in the sort of decisions that you're going to make when it comes to adopting rights and social responsibility. It's not a given that you're going to do so in a stringent fashion. Sorry, I'm just being very realistic with you. So there are very practical approaches. You might have to adhere to codes of conduct, auditing. As I mentioned, there's financial and non-financial auditing that occurs for European-based companies. So if you're a European-based company, most likely you're going to have to adhere to European norms and values even if you're overseas, beyond Europe. That's not the case for all companies globally, mind you. Practical approaches might be your ability and to have the capacity to implement the rights and social responsibilities. Let me put it to you in a different way. Why should a firm engage in corporate social responsibility? Why should it engage in impacting in being socially responsible? What's the utility in doing that? You want to take it up there? Yeah.
Further trust.
Trust in what?
Trust in the company itself.
Do we trust Apple? No? But no, you don't have an Apple product. I can't see your computer. No, you don't. Do you have any Apple devices? No? Anti-Apple through and through? You trust them. Who do you trust as a company? We don't trust any companies? You don't have a company in mind that you just, like, why did I really trust that company? Who do I think is responsible, socially responsible, that cares about me? Is there any company that cares about you that you think is socially responsible, that you trust? Yeah? Tomorrowland. I don't know if I trust Tomorrowland, but okay. Why do you trust Tomorrowland? Because you love the music?
No, but also because of the role that they play in the creation of new talent and to give them a spot. And that also in the way how they are adopting or how they are adapting to the current climate.
Are they socially responsible?
I would say so.
Yeah? And you trust them whole and whole, right?
I don't trust any company whole and whole.
Okay.
Definitely
Trustworthy.
trustworthy.
Okay. Yes? I'm sorry, can you hear? You can speak? Any food company? Now, I'll give you some data then. When we ask people, which companies do you trust? People generally do not trust companies. So it begs the question, why are companies investing money to become trustworthy? We generally do not trust companies, yet we buy their products. So why are companies investing in social responsibility? So it is a paradox in many respects, right? So it really begs the question why we are engaged in global rights and social responsibility if it does not actually feed into changing consumer habits in a way. Well, we can put it in a different way. There's often a tension between short-term profit and high rights standards. And this is something that's endemic in any sort of society you look at. If you're going to create better social conditions, it's going to cost more. Financially, that is. And so you need to really think that through in terms of your profit-making sort of maximization. Companies taking high road may face competitive disadvantages because they may not source it in places where it's cheaper. So this is an inherent dilemma that companies are going to face. By being ethical and by being socially responsible, it's going to cost you more. Now, let me be very clear. That's not mean that you shouldn't do it. But I'm just suggesting to you it comes with a higher financial cost. Remember what I mentioned beforehand. What's the inherent DNA of a company? It wants to survive. And in order to survive, it needs to maximize its profit and increase profit. And so if you're more socially responsible and it increases your costs, theoretically and practically, you are reducing the profit. So there's an inherent tension between short-term profit and standards that are rights and socially oriented responsibilities. So managers do face these tensions constantly in their sort of interactions, and in their engagement and in their strategies. You must understand what is the utility of doing social responsibility. Now, I'll give you an example where this can become very helpful. If you're a firm that is going into, say, a locale that they know very little about you, and you're extracting resources from that country, you are building infrastructure in that country to extract those resources, and that country has a bad reputation. It might be worthwhile to do social responsibility activities because it increases your marketing and improves the reputational sort of aspects of your company, which ultimately increases your profit. When we look at companies that we do trust, I'll tell you what they are. Coca-Cola. We trust Coca-Cola. It's interesting that we trust Coca-Cola so much. Why would we trust Coca-Cola? Well, it's also ironic that Coca-Cola is one of the most widely known companies out there. There's a relationship between a known product and trust. The more we know a product, the more likely we are to trust the product. It's coaxed within psychology and sociology. The more contact we have with a brand, the more contact we have with a company, the more likely we are to actually trust that company over time. So I would suggest to you, you're more likely to trust Apple if you have Apple products and you come into contact with Apple a lot. And it's a sort of a general truism that we see. So coming back to this conversation about social responsibility, often companies do want to be social. By their inherent nature, companies are not going to be socially responsible unless it feeds into their profit. Now, how do we make them more socially responsible? We pass regulations to do so. For many listed companies, depending on the exchange, they must have a social responsibility statement. They must actually say what they're doing to be socially compliant. It's usually an environmental statement. There's usually a governance statement. There's usually a statement dealing with looking at their impact on the community. And so you're seeing a regulatory sort of reasoning why companies are doing that, not necessarily out of the goodness of their heart. Companies are not altruistic. And bear that in mind as part of the DNA of the company itself. We can also talk about globally sustainable sort of imperatives. So because of hyperglobalization, we realize there's a few risks that gets undertaken that companies are going to be facing. Climate change, we can't escape that. And we can't escape that in any conversations about globalization. Pollution does not respect borders, as we know, and there's resource deprivation going on around the world. But beyond that, in the next 10, 15, 20 years, we're going to start seeing more physical risks to companies. And what I mean by that is you're going to see more supply chain disruptions because of globalization, because of climate change, rather. We're going to see transition risks when we move from carbon-intensive models to less carbon-intensive models. And companies are going to have to adapt to that. Europe is perhaps one of the market leaders when it comes to this. European companies are being asked to talk about their ESG standards. Again, that's part of the non-financial sort of accounting that they need to do now, that Europe does require large companies and listed companies to do. Global sustainability also provides market opportunities if you're a business. Net zero transition is going to require $275 trillion by 2050. That's a lot of profit to be taken. So if you're a company, you do want to have a strategy potentially to capitalize on this. It's also a reputational and talent sort of approach. We see younger generations in particular want to work for companies that are sustainable, and it feeds into their sort of recruiting drive and retention drive. But again, let me be very, very clear. the inherent nature of a business is not to do sustainability. It's not to do corporate social responsibility. The inherent nature of a business and an organization is to survive, and anything that allows it to survive, it usually does. And again, I can't stress this enough. Profit making is the way companies are increasing their power and their ability to survive. So that's how you approach it from a macro standpoint. There's also another ways we can think about global sustainability imperatives. We can look at measurement and disclosures. You cannot manage what you cannot measure. Managers need to measure the sort of things that they're engaged with for sustainability issues. There's science-based targets, which can be interesting for us to look at. There's supply chain engagement. Scope 3 just means that those emissions need to be measured as well. There's a circular economy models, integration challenges. There's greenwashing. These are things we need to think about effectively when we're looking at sustainability. Now, I wanted to end off by talking about competencies that managers need in a globalized society. In other words, we're looking at what do individuals today, what are the attributes managers and their workers do need in a globalized sort of society? You need cultural intelligence. You need to be able to function across diverse settings. And you might think, okay, that makes perfect sense. It's not only linguistically, but understanding differences in the way people behave. I'll give you an example of this. If I speak to my Dutch colleagues, often I think they're super direct. And often it's unless you're aware of their directedness compared to Canadians, for example, it can be very off-putting for us. I'll give you an example of this. If I was to give you feedback, I would tell you, this is the positives. You may want to do this, this, and this. So using suggestive language. So there's a sandwich approach, right? Good and bad. That's a cultural norm. With some of my Dutch colleagues, they might just go straight to saying, this is terrible. You might want to change this, this, and this, and this. And it's a cultural intelligence to understand. It's just cultural variance is in the way you approach things. So you need to be aware of those subtleties, but also be aware of norm variances as well. So you must have cultural intelligence if you're going to be working in a globalized sort of society. You must have contextual understanding. Political, economic, legal, and social systems are different across the world. There's a lot of stereotypes as well. So for someone who works in a lot of countries that are authoritarian, I can tell you there's a lot of stereotypes about authoritarian societies. For example, if Xi Jinping says jump, doesn't mean everyone's going to jump. It means 9 out of 10, maybe 99% of people are not going to jump. You need to understand the political environment you're engaged with. There's always hidden rules for success and hidden rules that might be minefields. And so if you do engage in a global sort of environment where you have to understand the local context in order to be successful, so you must understand those rules for success. You need to think flexible, strategically flexible, that is. Think scenarios, build opportunities, pivot quickly. This is straight out of the textbooks that they would tell you this is what you should do. But there's some caveats to that. Where your business is born sets the tone for the organizational structure of your business. And so it's difficult for companies to pivot if it's dramatically different than where your company is born. Ethical judgments, you're going to be continuously making more and more ethical judgments in your sort of work that you do. So you've got to balance competing values and take principled stance. There's also systems thinking. You've got to see the connections, feedback loops, and unintended consequences of the actions that you do. So these are some of the things that we often advise companies when they are trying to recruit people to have these qualities. Even if you're looking from an operational standpoint, there's an evolution that's going on here. There's an international division, there's a geographical division, there's a product matrix. There are transnational networks that are flexible and multi-directional. There's cross-unit teams that might work in one location and another team working in another location. So you've got to be aware of these and engaging with them in a meaningful way. One of the interesting things here is developing communities of practice. Communities of practice essentially mean that you are networking with people who are like-minded into the profession that you're engaged with. And we now have more and more global communities of practice. Here's an example. If you look at professors, I can give this lecture in Brussels, in Beijing, or in Toronto. It's the exact same facilities that I'm working with. It's the exact same software that I'm working with. And I can speak to those same professors who are all globally located, and we have similar issues that we face. And learning from each other is super important. Even though we are in a globalized, sort of connected world, we might face very similar localized challenges. So understanding the informal networks is super important as well. Now, I'm going to end off in the final slide by talking about some of the challenges. I would suggest to you there's a few challenges you will face as you enter a globalized environment for your job. You're going to have to reconcile efficiency with resilience. You're going to have to create more resilient systems. How do I source materials and goods from elsewhere where it can be shut off anytime soon? So you must build resilient systems. You want to reduce inequality. It's a challenge because ultimately, if your consumers cannot afford to pay for the goods and services, you're going to have a less and less consumer base. So inequality becomes your problem in the long run. You must manage the sustainability transition. And this is probably the largest issue you're going to face when you go into the working world. And the sort of consequences of globalization is the fact that we need to have a global response to sustainability. So it does require balancing short-term pressures with long-term value creation, so to speak. So I've pitched this in many different ways. I've pitched it at a very micro, macro, and meso levels, talking about globalization. This is probably the first lecture you would have on globalization, and you're going to talk about globalization in other forms without even realizing it. But again, in anything that you do when it comes to managing, understand the DNA of the organization you're engaged with. Your organization is there to survive. I'm repeating it so many times for a reason, because it feeds into everything we're talking about. Organizations do need to survive. That is in their inherent DNA. Whether we have globalized processes that influence it, whether we have localized processes influencing them, there's a will for the organization to survive. And in a capitalistic society, the profit motive is what makes organizations survive more so. The more profit, the more capital you gain, the more surplus capital you have, the more is your ability to survive. And this is if you have that sort of mindset, understanding the globalized forces I've been talking about becomes much more easier to understand why managers behave the way they do. Okay, any questions pertaining to this or any of the things I've talked about? I've been told we need to leave early because there's going to be someone coming into this room from the higher-ups. So we're going to end. That's all I've been told. I only relayed that message. So if there are no questions, I will see everyone in a future lecture. Thank you.